Richard thought he was seeing ghosts again. Just like the night he had mistaken a young stable boy outside his tent for his son, shortly after one of the washerwomen had reminded him so strongly of his Anne, just as she had looked when he rescued her from sanctuary, keeping her safe from his brother George. And now, that very same George was smirking at him. He didn't say a word. He simply stood before Richard's horse, staring and grinning. No one else seemed to notice him. Richard was tempted to ask what he wanted, but he feared he might be mistaking him for someone else again. He wanted to spare himself that humiliation. Sudden cheers broke his train of thought. Together with George, he turned his focus back to the battlefield. He looked down the hill toward the green expanse of Bosworth Field. It didn't take a single heartbeat to understand what had happened. The runner shouting at him was merely stating the obvious. "The Earl of Oxford has outwitted us. Richmond's vanguard has broken through." "Where's the Duke of Norfolk? Where is John Howard?" someone roared beside Richard. It was likely William Catesby. The king turned back to George, who now seemed to having a fit of laughter. Then the scout's answer dragged Richard back to reality. "Dead!" The king shook his head. Why did God allow this? "Then we must advance with the center," he shouted to Catesby and Radcliffe, who were mounted beside him. "Percy must move his rearguard up to our position." Radcliffe nodded and galloped off. Then the king turned to Brackenbury, who was waiting orders just behind his left shoulder. "Any news from the Stanley brothers?" It was high time they declared their side. He held Thomas Stanley's eldest son hostage to force his loyalty. In truth, he had never intended to execute Stanley's heir, but his rage toward the two brothers grew with every passing second. George's ghost apparently found that hilarious. "Still standing like Roman statues. It's enviable how still they can keep," reported Brackenbury, the loyal constable of the tower. The king had always liked him and his dry wit. Catesby had now pulled his horse up right alongside the king's. "Your Grace," he called out, no longer needing to shout, "we do not have to decide everything today. We can fall back and regroup. England stands behind you, not Henry of Richmond." This earned him a shake of the head from George. For once, Richard felt a pulse of sympathy for his dead brother. "As soon as Northumberland moves the rearguard, we charge with the center and make the most of our high ground. We will crush Richmond and his rebels," he answered. In that moment, Radcliffe returned. His face was as white as chalk. Richard already knew the answer, but he had to ask the question anyway. "Is Percy coming with the rearguard?" Radcliffe only shook his head. "Then what is he doing?" Nothing at all," his friend stammered. "He is just sitting there, watching." George had tears of laughter in his eyes. And suddenly Richard understood why he was seeing him. The men who were bound to be loyal to him were doing nothing. They were just watching instead of saving him. Just as he had done all those years ago when Edward had executed their brother. "I am sorry," he said. His voice fled, speaking toward the ghostly figure. "Far too late," came the answer, just as hollow. But perhaps he was wrong. Suddenly the king spotted something he assumed was another hallucination, until Catesby yelled beside him, "Is that Tudor?" It was real. The Earl of Richmond was moving out from his rearguard with a small escort, riding toward the center. And if Richard had a clear line of sight to him, it meant no one was left in his way. From that moment on, Richard operated on pure instinct. His body just took over. He put on his helmet adorned with the royal crown. Some madman had stolen it from his tent that morning, but his men had recovered it shortly after. "Charge!" he bellowed. He drew his sword and dug his spurs into his horse. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Catesby, Radcliffe, Brackenbury, and his escort struggle to keep pace, though they managed to follow. His pulse hammered so hard in his veins that it physically ached. The king loved that feeling. He was alive, and he was closing in on his enemy. Tudor had spotted him. The Earl of Richmond stared in shock and drew his own blade. It was too late for him to escape. Richard swung his sword and suddenly saw his other brother. Edward was standing right beside Tudor's horse, looking at him with pity. What was he doing here? The king struck but missed his target. Instead, his blade cut down Tudor's standard bearer. Still, the force of the charge unseated Richmond. Richard would simply kill him with a second blow instead of his first. Perfection was something reserved for God alone anyway. As Richard raised his sword again, his older brother distracted him once more. Edward pointed with a sorrowful look toward the king's left. There, the worst sight of his life unfolded. William Stanley was charging toward him with an entire army, several thousand men. Richard had perhaps 20 soldiers left around him. "Right, kill Stanley's son," he screamed toward William Catesby. Catesby shook his head. "I will not leave you." "Go!" Richard boomed. Finally, Catesby galloped off. It was not a moment too soon. Stanley's host crashed into Richard and his retinue. He and his men were hurled from their saddles. Most of them died right then and there. Richard was not so lucky. He managed to scramble up, plant his feet, and grip his sword. In the chaotic melee, he succeeded in striking down several foes. "Treachery!" he roared over and over. No one would ever say he had tried to hide. Everyone would tell the tale of how he fought bravely to the bitter end. For a brief, fleeting instant, he saw Edward and Tudor standing side by side. Both seemed to look at him with sorrow before closing their eyes and turning away. Richard did not understand why, not immediately. Then came the dull, heavy impact at the back of his skull. The pain spread instantly through his entire body, consuming his world in darkness. And he knew his fight was over.